This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of Across the Board. Across the Board is a podcast which deals with the board of directors, corporate governance, and risk management at the board level. Across the Board is sponsored by the ARC Group. The ARC Group is the publisher of my most recent book, 2016, The Year in Corporate FCPA Enforcement, Cardinal and Provident. You can find out more information on my book and the ARC Group at their website, ARK-Group. That's arc-group.com. Today, I have with me Sheila Hooda, and we have a very interesting discussion about the role of boards of directors and strategic risks. She talks about risk as a key component of strategy and the board's role in working with senior management in the oversight of strategy and risk as part of the strategy. She talks about the board's role in assessing risk as it intersects with strategy. We discuss risk management, the risk management process of forecasting, risk assessment, and risk-based monitoring, and the board's role in this process. She talks about the type of information she would expect to receive as a board of director. She talks about the type of information that she would have presented to a board when she was a C-suite level executive. She talks about the type of training that a board member should receive on risk management, and strategic risk. She also goes into the various roles of the board around oversight and key governance functions, which I think that you will find fascinating. If you're a board member, you will certainly enjoy this. If you report to a board, you will learn a lot about what your board expects from you. Across the Board is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox here for another episode of Across the Board, a podcast about the board of directors and corporate governance. Today, you are in for a really big treat because I have Sheila Hooda. Sheila is an independent director, advisor to CEOs, former C-level operating executive with 30-plus years of global experience. She has provided strategic direction, driven growth, and transformed Fortune 500 firms. She is the CEO of Alpha Advisory Partners and serves on the board of Mutual of Omaha Insurance Company and Virtus Investment Partners. She is a thought leader and regular contributor and speaker on governance, strategy, and leadership. Prior to her board service, she held senior operating positions at TIAA CREF, Credit Suisse Investment Bank, Thomson Reuters, and McKinsey & Company across the U.S., Europe, and Asia and India. She's a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also serves on boards focusing on education, women's empowerment, and global policy. So Sheila, with that long-winded introduction, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So Sheila, I am very excited to visit with you because we are going to talk about a subject that is not only, I think, incredibly important, but equally importantly, not as well understood. So I wanted to visit with you about the area of the board's role in the oversight of strategy and how risk plays a part of that strategy. Now, I understand that your remarks today will be yours and not anyone your company or board you're on, and that's certainly acceptable. But in your working professional history, could you talk about your understanding of the board's role in the oversight of strategy?
Definitely. And before I start, I'd like to sort of recap what are some of the key focus areas or roles of the board. There are basically 5 key areas that the board remains focused on. The first is to balance the interests of the company and shareholders and the other stakeholders for the long-term growth of the company. The second is to provide oversight for the development of the long-term strategy of the company and for its long-term sustainability and profitability. The third is to provide oversight for the financial and operating risks of the company, to mitigate them and control them. The fourth is to ensure all regulatory obligations are met. And the fifth, and quite important, is also to take responsibility for CEO succession planning. However, in this podcast, we are going to very much focus on the increasingly important role of the board in its oversight of strategy and risk. And this is especially true today in the current environment in terms of the convergence of the risk and strategic issues facing boards as companies respond to new and emerging technologies. It could be artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, digitization, connectivity, rapidly changing consumer preferences, a lot of it driven by these new technologies, and also by changing regulation. So what we are seeing today as we talk about, as boards focus on strategy and risk and their convergence, is unprecedented change, never seen since the time of the Industrial Revolution. And boards and the C-suite need to understand the scope of this change to direct their companies. So essentially what boards are doing as they oversee competitive strategy is overseeing it in a world of massive disruption. And therefore, in this environment, how would boards work with management? Now we are just focusing on strategy in this whole era of disruption. But I see it as, 5 key things. One is, how would they imagine the future of the company? What is the changing business model? How would they seize the opportunity as business models change? Second, how do they think about competitors, new and emerging? Third, how do they see and look at customers with the new and evolving needs? The fourth, our boards need to oversee and challenge management and question them if they're leveraging the insights and analytics that are being drawn as they develop their strategy. And last, the fifth one is, with all this change across customers, business models, competitors, and analytics, how are they best leveraging innovation so that they can seize on the opportunities that come from disruption? Now, I know this is a long-winded way of talking and introducing the importance of strategy, but the reason I wanted to dwell on this in more detail is that this tremendous disruption and change is also bringing significant, but, I repeat, but different opportunities. It's disruption bringing opportunities. However, as you seize the opportunity, there's another big if there. Boards have to enhance their risk management. And at the same time, this risk management is a changing and moving sort of risk management. As you rethink strategy, you're seeing a changing risk landscape. And therefore, you reconsider or recalibrate your approach to risk. So to sustain growth and performance going forward, risk management will need to be more balanced, more agile, more integrated with the business. And boards will need to confirm that management gives appropriate consideration, very importantly, to manage the risk-return trade-off to drive capital and value creation. And I repeat, disruption gives opportunity, but opportunity brings risk. And therefore, the board's dual role in this risk and strategy equation is to challenge management to manage the risk-return trade-off for value creation. And the questions that boards could ask in this context is really, have boards, have companies and their management developed a risk management approach that has a strategic exposure to realize the opportunity while minimizing any new emerging preventable risks? Are they proactive and agile enough? Are they leveraging data, analytics, and technology platforms to address this risk? And on the cyber front, which is another huge risk that boards and managements are encountering, is that has the board considered its risk appetite in terms of business disruption, the loss of information or the system downtime? And how could the company, differentiate itself in terms of how it manages its risk? So the point is, disruption brings big opportunities. Boards and management have to be strategic to leverage and capture this opportunity. But with the opportunity comes tremendous new, unseen, emerging risks in addition to the existing risks. And how proactive and agile and integrated are management and boards as they oversee this risk?
Sheila, I'd like to now ask you to think about, or at least respond to that concept from two different directions. The first is from the board's perspective. What does a board need to understand to be able to manage, or at least, oversee that risk? But equally important, from below the board's position, from either the C-suite or senior executive level, what information do they need to provide to the board to allow it to engage in an appropriate level of oversight?
Sure, Tom. I'd like to take a bit of a step back before I come to the information part, because I view that as a little bit of the nitty-gritty of risk management. At the outset, boards do not manage risk. The management does it. Boards provide oversight. So boards, the way they oversee risk is around 4 key dimensions. The first, I would say, is challenging management, or working with management, or questioning management as it develops its current and future enterprise risk appetite and framework. And what I mean by this word of enterprise risk appetite is really, what is the risk tolerance of the company? How do you define it? How do you give the boundaries? How do you profile it? The second is, and this comes to the point you mentioned, Tom, about what's the information you want, what's the content they need, is around the board's focus on and providing oversight for the implementation of the risk appetite. And this is the measurement of the risk, the reporting, the monitoring, the stress testing, the risk models, etc. So this is the second dimension of the oversight of risk that the board has. The third, and equally important, is setting the risk culture of a company. What is the tone at the top that the board sets? What are the incentives that are offered for taking of these risks? We have the whole Wells Fargo scenario, correct? That was a risk incentive tone of the top that was largely ignored, and that went disastrously askew.
Yes.
And the last one is overseeing of the role of the chief risk officer. So in these 4 dimensions of oversight of risk, defining the risk appetite, oversight of the implementation of the risk appetite, setting the tone and the risk culture, and lastly, overseeing the chief risk officer. In that framework, the management and the senior executives provide the board with a certain level of information and reporting. And that reporting and information is very much an outcome of how the board and the senior management and the C-suite has defined the risk appetite. How would they review, monitor the key, the key risk dimensions of the company? So if it's a financial services company, it could be credit risk or market risk. If it's a industrial type company, there would be an operational risk. Every company has a compliance risk. There's a people risk, there's a reputational risk, there's a technology risk. So a lot depends on the type of company and the different risk dimensions that impact the company. So once based on that risk appetite and the different dimensions that impact the company, then there would be different metrics that are set up. How would you measure that risk? What are the benchmarks that the company would set up? What are some of the heat maps that they would do to gauge the sensitivity of the risk? So the information would vary, but it's very much geared and falls as an outcome of the overall risk appetite that the company has set up and how the board and management want to review and monitor that risk. I want to add a little point here, Tom, if I may. Just in terms of how the information flows to the board, different companies have different approaches, and again, it depends on how the company wants to manage and view its risk. But some companies manage risk as part of the audit committee, and some companies have very distinct and separate risk committees. A lot depends on how dynamic and how serious the risk dimensions are. Financial services companies, insurance companies, largely driven by regulation, tend to have separate risk committees. A lot of other companies have risk committees as part of their audit committee. So it depends on the risk dimensions of the company. Second, I want to say is increasingly across the board, as part of good risk management and oversight, there is the appointment of the new role of the chief risk officer. Someone who sort of has overall accountability for risk, manages the risk management system, the risk control mechanism, the information flow, shapes the principles, etc. So these were 2 points I wanted to bring through, how the risk is managed by the board and at the C-level. And the skills required for effective risk committee members is, I would say a blend of 3 things. One is a good in-depth knowledge and understanding of the company and its business. So they appreciate the risk challenges, financial expertise for scenarios and framework. And then you need to have some technical ability, to understand the stress testing dynamics and the measurement tools, etc.
How would you advocate that a board be trained on what to ask for and what to opine in this oversight role?
Two things. One is there are what I call the big macro and strategic risks. And then the second are what I would call very much the company-specific risks. And the macro risks are, the big trends that are shaping the industry. I know that the boards which I sit on, we always start with the macro perspective. The economy, regulation, competitors, new entrants, new technology, the political environment, understanding the environment that company operates in. And we spend a considerable amount of time on this because these new and emerging threats, you've seen the taxi industry be changed with Uber. You've seen Airbnb impacting hotels and hospitality. There are new and emerging entrants that are constantly lurking around and can literally wipe out your business. So we are very focused on the macro dimensions and having external or internal experts talk about this, present this, discuss this, document it. The second part is, so this is what I would call training or information gathering, understanding of the macro environment. So when you have a board member, you want to train someone or you want to bring someone up to speed, they have to be big picture macro thinkers. The second is very much what I would say business specific, and that flows from the risk appetite statement of the bank. What are the key risk categories? What are the benchmarks? What are the metrics? And it flows from there.
I look at the risk management process as a three-step process. Forecasting, risk assessment, and risk-based monitoring. If you agree with this formulation, Sheila, where do you see the board's role in this process?
Tom, I agree with your 3 steps, forecasting, risk assessment, and monitoring. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, I view that as part of the second dimension of a board role, which is the monitoring and providing oversight of the implementation of the risk appetite. I think as a board, there are a couple of other dimensions, including what I would call the first macro level dimension, which is setting the overall current and future. And I repeat the word future because, a lot of time boards are very backward looking or current status looking, and you have so many new and emerging risks. You're setting the overall enterprise risk appetite, and that framework is probably the biggest and most important dimension of the role of the board. The second is the implementation, which is, as you have eloquently put down, forecasting it, assessing it, reporting it, monitoring it, testing it, doing scenarios, plannings against it, etc. So that's part of the implementation part of it. I want to reiterate that setting the risk culture and oversight of the chief risk officer are also part of the 4 dimensions of the oversight of risk that I'd like to have as a key takeaway from this.
Well, Sheila, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but this has been a fascinating exploration of the role of board in the convergence of strategy and risk. And I have to say, your holistic approach, I think, is very not only well rounded, but it's exactly what an oversight function would provide to senior management and a C-suite level executive. So I really look forward to continuing this conversation with you. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Across the Board. If you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the only podcast dealing with the intersections of corporate governance, boards of directors, and strategic risk. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Across the Board, and I hope you'll join me next week for our next episode.